Okay, I can't see anybody else stuck, so we will begin. Thank you so much for joining us today for this talk on Augustus De Morgan. You'll notice that your microphones and cameras have been disabled, so if you do want to ask a question, please put those into the chat box and I'll ask them to June on your behalf at the end of today's presentation, so as not to interrupt throughout. I hope that sounds okay to everybody. It's my real privilege to welcome June back to the Foundation to give us a talk today on William De Morgan's father, the notable 19th century mathematician Augustus De Morgan, which she's done before. So I'm very grateful that she's joining us in this new format online today. June is the Professor of History of Mathematics at the School of Mathematics and Statistics in the Open University, having joined as a full-time PhD student in 1989. She has previously worked in art galleries in London for several years before studying mathematics, and then worked in the city before returning to King's to study for an MSc in mathematics, after which she rejoined the OU. June chose the OU because it's the only university in the country which offered the opportunity for graduate study in the history of mathematics within a mathematics department. One of June's most notable, I certainly think, accolades is that she was awarded the Royal Society Wilkins-Burnell Medawar Medal for her research in 19th and 20th century mathematics this year in 2021. And part of the reason for that, I like to think, is her dedication and commitment to sharing mathematics with a wider audience, as evidenced in her support of our exhibition Sublime Symmetry, which explores William De Morgan's mathematics in his design through lending her very generous knowledge and incredible knowledge to our programme, to the catalogue, and for giving this talk to us today. So huge thanks, June, and welcome back to the Foundation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. I think it's going to be a bit hard for me to live up to it, but I'll try my best. So thank you all for coming. So as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about William De Morgan's father, Augustus De Morgan, who taught William De Morgan mathematics when he was Professor of Mathematics at University College London. And we will see little glimpses of William appearing in this talk. My title, it's easier to square the circle than to get around a mathematician, is very sort of typical of Augustus De Morgan. He really liked sort of punning and sort of amusing, saying things in amusing ways. So you are going to get a little bit of maths in this talk, but you're not going to be asked to do very much maths. It's really more to give you a flavour of Augustus De Morgan as a person, and maybe to give a sort of sense of the environment in which William De Morgan grew up. So let me tell you a little bit about squaring the circle, because as that's in my title, I'm sure you've all heard people talk about that as kind of something that's impossible. And it originated with the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. It's one of their 3 classical problems. And the problem was actually, was it possible to construct a square with the same area as a circle, but using only an unmarked ruler and compasses to do so? This was a very traditional way for the Greeks to do to prove things. Euclid's Elements, which you may have heard of, and I'll return to them actually, one of the great texts of antiquity. Euclid's geometry, all the sort of propositions there and the constructions there are it's all unmarked ruler and compasses. So it was a kind of very natural way for the Greeks to try and prove things, but they couldn't do it. But what happened in the course of trying to do it, they developed lots of other interesting maths along the way. And on this slide, I've just shown you on the left-hand side, Archimedes had a go at it, and although he constructed a triangle with the same area as a circle, from which it's easy then to construct a square, he didn't do it using only ruler and compasses. And in the middle, there's a book that was written by Hobson, who was the Sadlerian professor of math at Cambridge at the beginning of the 20th century, just to show you, I mean, he even wrote a whole book about it. So, I mean, just give you the kind of emphasis of the problem. And of course, I couldn't really resist this article on the right, squaring the circle, of course, it's to do with Brexit. We probably don't want to say any more about that, but it probably is rather apposite, sadly. So what about Augustus De Morgan? So let me tell you a little bit about his life. So he was born in India in 1806. Shortly after his birth, one of his eyes became infected and he lost the sight of one eye, but it doesn't seem to have affected him, certainly not in his mathematics. His parents moved back to England and he was brought up in the southwest of England, and then he goes to Cambridge. Now Cambridge at this period and throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century was what I would describe as the beating heart of British mathematics. If you wanted to study mathematics, you went to Cambridge. If you wanted to study classics or so on, you went to Oxford. And the mathematical tripos at Cambridge, which was the examination that the students sat in their final year, was a really grueling experience, but the rewards were great for the students who did well. And if you were in the first class, you were known as a wrangler, and the senior wrangler was the person who was the top student of the year. And if you were senior wrangler, that was a passport to basically any career you wanted, not just in mathematics, it could be the church, it could be in the law or whatever. And students were feted and admired who became the senior wranglers. I mean, sometimes when they went home to their local town, there were fireworks and all kinds of things. I mean, I can't really emphasize too much actually what a big deal it was to be a high wrangler. The results were announced in the national newspapers and the local newspapers and so on. And De Morgan graduated as fourth wrangler. So that set him up pretty well for whatever career he wanted, really. But although he was showed himself to be a very good mathematician, he couldn't stay at Cambridge because he was a non-conformist, and he wasn't Cambridge. You had to sort of subscribe to the articles, so that meant he could not have a career at Cambridge. That was his personal choice. So he goes to London and he decides to study law at Lincoln's Inn. But as luck would have it, really, for him, in 1826, a group of liberal-minded intellectuals founded the self-styled London University. And it was inspired by, he was sort of inspired by their sort of progressive aims and the secular character of what became known as the Godless Institution on Gower Street, and he applied for the post of Professor of Mathematics, and he was duly appointed. And note, this is only a year after he's graduated. So he's established, he has a position in London. He's Professor of Mathematics at the London University, which will become University College London. But a few years later, in 1831, he resigns. And this is on a matter of principle. And this is something we'll see in De Morgan's life. He took issue with some decisions that had been made by the council of the university, and he was not to be moved. So he resigned. But his successor there died unexpectedly. He drowned, in fact, in 1836. And they managed to persuade him to return to, which was by now University College London. And that's where he made his career. He marries Sophia Friend in 1837. She was the daughter of the mathematician William Friend, who's known in mathematical circles because he was one of the last people who famously really rejected the use of negative numbers. This was a really kind of important sort of philosophical debate that was going on in the 19th century. But then in 1866, he resigns again. Again, another question of principle with decisions made by the council of the university. Probably the only person at UCL to have resigned twice, I would imagine. And he dies then in 1871. He was incredibly productive. He was the author of 18 books. He wrote more than 160 papers, countless unsigned reviews in periodicals like the Athenaeum and so on, reviews of books, of articles, of all kinds of things. And he was a vigorous correspondent. And the archives at at Senate House in at the University of London have De Morgan's archive, and it's massive. There's just masses and masses of things there, which is an incredibly rich archive. It's almost too rich, really. A colleague of mine in the States has been trying to write a biography of De Morgan for some time, but there's just so much material. But he was a great lover of puns and puzzles, and importantly, I think, for William De Morgan, he was Augustus was a gifted cartoonist, and we'll see lots of examples. So I want to start with the only little bit of maths I'm going to ask you to think about, and this is an example of De Morgan's playfulness. And this is a little question that De Morgan posed. He said, I was X years old in AD X squared. So the question, of course, is what is X? And have we got enough information to be able to work out what X is? So I'll give you just a few minutes, not even a few minutes, I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Okay, well, I have already given you actually enough information to be able to solve this, because you know when De Morgan was born, which was 1806, and you know when De Morgan died, which was 1871, which means that X squared must be a number in the 1800s. So, and in fact, there's only one possibility. X squared equals 1849, and X is 43. And if we subtract 43 from 1849, we get 1806. So it's very, very sort of typical little thing that De Morgan liked to do. Here we now have a drawing by De Morgan, and this is of his initials, and as he captioned it, ADM's initials alive and kicking, and you can see the A and the D and the M in there. And you can see even from this that he was a careful draftsman, and he adopted this motif, and it was actually later adopted by his wife, Sophia De Morgan. She had it put on her memoir of him. And then the London Mathematical Society, of which I'll say more later, because De Morgan was the founding president of the society, adopted the motif to put on their most prestigious prize, which is their De Morgan medal. And we can see it here, and there's a letter which shows the design and showing them wanting to use De Morgan's motif. Here we have an example of a letter written by De Morgan to a Miss Anna Blackwell. I'm afraid I don't know who she was, but he's talking to her about Pétain's plan for an aerial platform. And in the letter, he writes that according to Monsieur Pétain, if a man could but blow hard enough, he could blow himself up into the air by holding out a looking glass obliquely and blowing against it. And you can see the drawing where he's got Pétain up in the air blowing against the looking glass. And this is a very sort of typical sort of little sketch from De Morgan. But perhaps the richest source we have of De Morgan's cartoons comes from this gallery of portraits, which is owned by the Royal Astronomical Society, a society with which De Morgan was associated for a long time. And again, I'll say a bit about that later. And this is a fantastic book. What it contains is a number of biographies of mathematicians, which were written and published by De Morgan. And they're short biographies, which are published in periodicals and things, and he's had them all bound together in a book. And then he has illustrated these biographies, and he's got lots of little sketches. It run through with these lovely sketches. And the one on the title page here we see is Corpus Mathematicum, or the Devil's Own, paraded by an assault on the church. So a very clear indication of De Morgan's views about the church in there. But I particularly like this one. This is the symbols plus and minus destroying each other. And then he's put in brackets funny algebra. And of course, he's written FUN with a with a little 2 on the end, which is like n squared. So instead of 2 n's, he's put the exponent 2, which is rather nice. And this is perhaps one of my favorite ones. Symbolic notation, an equivalent form for the author of symbol in search of a meaning. Now you have to know your 19th century mathematicians really to know what this is about. But as soon as I saw it, I knew exactly what it was, because in fact it is a drawing of George Peacock. And Peacock taught De Morgan when he was at Cambridge. He's one of the leading figures of British mathematics, the first half of the 19th century. And the allusion is to Peacock's treatise on algebra, and where Peacock introduced his principle of permanence of equivalent forms. And this is where he's separating arithmetical and symbolical algebra. And Peacock had a distinguished career. He was the Lowndean professor. He became Lowndean professor at Cambridge. But I really love this particular drawing. Actually, it reminds me of rather like some of Edward Lear's sketches, if you know what I mean by those, with illustrations to his limericks. Now, a mathematician for whom De Morgan exerted really an important influence was someone called George Boole. And Boole is very important from the point of view of the modern development of computing. And he initiated a correspondence with De Morgan, and they became lifelong friends. And he's quite clear in one of his important works, one of Boole's important works, The Mathematical Analysis of Logic. He says that in the spring of 1847, my attention was directed to the question then moved between Sir William Hamilton and Professor De Morgan, and I was induced by the interest which it inspired to resume the almost forgotten thread of former inquiries. So De Morgan, this debate he was having with the Scottish philosopher William Hamilton, and not to be confused by the Irish mathematician William Hamilton, was what reignited Boole in his interest in logic. And De Morgan too was well known for his work on logic. It's one of the things for which he's best remembered, in fact. But Boole is very clear that De Morgan played an important role in getting him to start working on this again. And these two works by Boole, The Mathematical Analysis of Logic and the Investigation of the Laws of Thought, on which are founded the mathematical theories of logic and probability, are two very important texts of the mathematical texts of the mid-19th century. And we can see here is De Morgan's own book on formal logic, which established the standard for modern books on logic. And I should have mentioned with Boole, some of you may have come across Boolean algebra, which stems from Boole. And Boolean algebra is algebra just modeled with just two symbols, 1 and 0. And of course, this is on and off. This is what we use. It's absolutely fundamental to computing, the binary system, which Boole developed in those books that I showed you. And so De Morgan, his logic was also very important. It was, as I show the quote here, has established the standard for modern books on logic. And I've included here this quote from William De Morgan, because he references, this was clearly made a mark on him, because he says a good deal of my early life was spent in these studies, that was logic based on maths, and I inherited perhaps some of the faculty, or at least I should have, for I come from a mathematical and logical family. Now the thing that if people have heard of De Morgan, when they study mathematics at university, it's through De Morgan's laws, and these are the laws of union and law of, and of intersection. And basically, I've shown on the left in a Venn diagram description, if you have a couple of sets A and B, you can show how they intersect So here the red bit is where the two sets intersect, and the dark blue bit is where the sets don't exist at all. And then there are these formal laws from which you can develop important results. And there's various notations that can be used. I've written it out in words at the top, and then there's a kind of formal notation for it down below. Now, another area in which De Morgan worked, did a considerable amount of work, was in history of mathematics. Wrote nearly 100 articles on the topics, many of them biographical, as evidenced in the Book of Portraits, and 3 historical books. And this is rather a nice quote from it, again, very typical De Morgan. Dates are as important to the historian as they are to the Arab. The Arab, however, has to dry his. The historians are as dry as possible from the outset. Now, of course, there's something sort of quite important here in a sense, because dates are important. We do kind of need to kind of establish some sort of chronology, but dates on their own don't tell us really, they certainly don't tell us all we need to know. We need some real context about them. So he's saying, well, basically, they're very dry without anything else, but it's very nicely put here. But I'm just going to show you one example of his work in history of mathematics, and it's really quite an important one. It was his exposure of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is a great hero of British mathematics, and he was particularly in the 18th century and going into the 19th century. And what this has to do with is the fact that Newton, as many of you will probably or may know, is that he's one of the things for which he's well known is for his discovery or creation, depending on your point of view, of the differential calculus. Now, Newton had he discovered it in the 1860s. I'm sorry, in the 1760s. No, 1660s. Sorry, I'm in De Morgan mode here. Newton had discovered it in the 1660s, and but he hadn't published it. He had discussed it with some friends, and there was some. It was kind of known through correspondence and so forth. But then in the 1680s, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German mathematician philosopher, also discovered the calculus, but he published it. And then this became known to some of Newton's supporters, and a priority dispute ensued. Now, Leibniz had been in correspondence with Newton, but it's very clear from the correspondence that he hadn't learned anything of the calculus from his correspondence with Newton. But Newton's supporters were very incensed by Leibniz's publication. They were sure that there had been some plagiarism. And this all boiled over into, in the end, what happened was that the Royal Society had a commission to investigate this. And it was investigated, and unsurprisingly, it came down in favor of Newton. Well, you may say unsurprisingly, because Newton did actually discover it first or whatever. But there wasn't any actual plagiarism. And the important thing to know is that, in fact, at the time, the president of the Royal Society was none other than Newton himself. And he was also the author of the report that basically gave him full credit and kind of denounced Leibniz as a plagiarist. And it was De Morgan who kind of uncovered all of this, much to the dismay of the Royal Society, of course. And we have Sophia De Morgan in her memoir. She makes reference to this, and where she says that that Augustus De Morgan's memoir on Newton was, after Bailey's Life of Flamsteed, the first English work in which the weak side of Newton's character was made known. And justice to Leibniz, to Flamsteed, even to Whiston, call for this exposure. Now, Flamsteed was the astronomer royal, and he'd had a run-in with Newton. Flamsteed was a practical astronomer, and Newton was the sort of theoretical, the person who sort of his work was theoretical, and Newton certainly didn't behave well towards Flamsteed either. And we can see that here, this is what De Morgan himself wrote in 1846 about Newton. He said, well, the great fault, or rather misfortune, of Newton's character was one of temperament. Showed itself in fear of opposition. When he became king of the world of science, it made him desire to be absolute monarch, and never did monarch find more obsequious subjects. His treatment of Leibniz, of Flamsteed, and we believe of Whiston, is in each case a stain upon his memory. And he tried to get this work published by the Royal Society, and they rejected it, perhaps not surprisingly. And on the in the archives, he sort of scribbled a note on this paper that he wrote, where he's pretty sort of damning about the Royal Society. He says, he says here, according to our forms, i.e. he's kind of pretending to be the Royal Society, justice can only be done to Leibniz only by a committee, but a committee of our society never does justice. Therefore, the proposed is impracticable. He's making his position very clear here. And he also, he writes to David Brewster, who a Scottish scientist who'd written a biography of Newton. And he says to Brewster, he's got no doubt that Leibniz was used by the English with every sort of unfairness, that Newton was party to all the ill usage. He says, I think that the attempt to show that it was possible that Leibniz could have got any hint from what he saw of Newton was a piece of effrontery. I think that Newton himself acted in a manner not becoming a gentleman in several particulars. But De Morgan didn't have a very high opinion of Brewster either. And when he wrote to the astronomer John Herschel, he said, well, David Brewster is the king of slapdashery. He is now very old and writes without any thinking. He never wrote with much. So that's pretty damning in his opinion of Brewster. And here we have another one of De Morgan's delightful cartoons. So this is showing the sort of polemic between Newton and Flamsteed. So it's the discordance between theory and practice. Now, another mathematical area in which De Morgan is very closely associated was with this problem called the Four-Colour Conjecture. And Augustus De Morgan in 1852 wrote to the Irish mathematician William Rowan Hamilton, and he said, a student of mine asked me today to give him a reason for a fact, which I did not know was a fact, and do not yet. He says that if a figure be anyhow divided and that the compartments differently coloured, so that figures with any portion of common boundary line are differently coloured, 4 colours may be wanted, but not more. The following is his case in which 4 colours are wanted. A, B, C, D are names of colours. Query, cannot a necessity for 5 or more be invented? And so this is the Four-Colour Conjecture. And he was still writing about it in 1860. And he says, well, it must be known to map colorers that 4 different colors are enough. He's let the counties come cranking in, as Hotspur says, reference to Shakespeare here, very typical again of De Morgan, with as many and as odd convolutions as the designer chooses to give them. Still, 4 colors will be enough to make all requisite distinction. Now, the point at issue here is that people, after this problem had been announced, people started trying to colour in maps, and they found they only needed 4 colours. But it's a very different thing to be able to prove that you only need 4 colours. You can colour in as many maps as you like using only 4 colours, but it still doesn't prove that there might not be some map out there that actually needs more than 4 colours. And so this became a very sort of well-known problem. And often with mathematics, actually, it's the case you have things that are very easy to state, like that's a very easy problem to state, anybody can kind of understand it. And you'd think it would be very easy to prove, but actually it turns out that it was very difficult to prove. And we have various mathematicians have a go at it. Arthur Cayley, who's the Sadlerian professor in at Cambridge makes progress. He doesn't come up with a proof, but in 1879 and 1880, two mathematicians, Kemp and Tate, both come up with proofs that get published. But then in 1890, it's proved that their proofs are wrong. And Percy Hayward proved the five-colour theorem. So he proved that actually it was possible to cover any kind of map with only 5 colours, but he couldn't get it down to 4. So, still there were many mathematicians jumped in on this and tried to prove it without success, until 1976, when Apple and Harkin succeeded, but with the aid of a computer. And they showed that the number of maps, the different types of maps, they kind of looked at every conceivable type of map you could possibly want. They thought you needed 1936 different types of maps were what you needed, and you need to be able to kind of prove it for all of these. But this was very complicated to do, and they did it with a computer. But this turned out to be extremely controversial. It was the first time a mathematical problem had been solved of this nature been solved with a computer, and people really worried about whether was this really a proof. How could we know whether there wasn't a mistake in the computer proof? After all, there'd been mistakes in the earlier mathematician's proof. And to give you an idea of how long the computer proof was, the printout, when it was all kind of folded up, it was 4 foot high. I mean, this is some massive proof to be gone through. And it sort of generated a whole new area of kind of mathematics, of people actually thinking about what does it mean, what actually, you know, is a computer proof? Is it the same as a proof done by hand? And what do we mean by proof? There are all kinds of questions you can ask. And in fact, even when people prove things, not necessarily by computer, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that the problem is sort of put to bed, because people often think, well, perhaps I could come up with a better proof, a shorter proof, a neater proof, a prettier proof. And in this case, 1996, there was another computer-aided proof, but a much shorter one. And then in 2005, the proof was validated using something called a Coq-proof assistant, sort of interactive theorem prover. So it's still some sort of computer element, but it's not the same as a computer proof. But they didn't need to trust the computer programs, because this actually showed that indeed it had been proved. But it's kind of interesting to see how a letter can generate a great amount of mathematics. And of course, people in trying to prove this problem came up with lots of other interesting mathematics along the way. Now, one of De Morgan's sort of best loved works was his Budget of Paradoxes, which was published posthumously by Sophia De Morgan, and it's full of lots of tidbits of De Morgan's work, various extracts from articles and things he wrote, things that he just found really interesting, and particularly kind of paradoxes in mathematics and so forth. And it's full of just wonderful things. And I'm just going to mention one of them here, which is to do with circle squaring. We're coming back to that, because even though the Greeks knew, it's pretty certain they knew that they couldn't square the circle, but they couldn't prove it. And in fact, it wasn't proved until the late 19th century. But that didn't stop loads and loads of people being sure that they could prove it. But it depends on the value of this constant pi, which you might recall from that is the ratio of the diameter of a circle to its circumference. And the problem with pi is that it's not a rational number. You can't write it down in a fraction, a nice fraction. We have an approximation to it. It's quite often approximated to 22/7, but you can't write down a decimal expansion of it either that is either stops or is, so for example, if you have 3 3/4, that's 3.75. You've got the decimal expansion, and that's stopped at 0.75. Or you can't have, or it doesn't have a recurring decimal. So like 1/3 is 0.3333 recurring forever. And so you can write that down as a fraction. But pi is, you can't write that down. It just goes on forever. And there are people who've spent hours and masses of computer time, and I can't remember how many millions of digits of pi have now been calculated. This particular persistent circle squarer, James Smith, was convinced that pi actually equaled 22/8. And he wrote several books trying to prove this, or thinking that he had proved it. And he was constantly pestering De Morgan. And one of his articles he actually entitled Professor De Morgan in the Pillory Without Hope of Escape. He really thought, James Smith really thought he'd nailed it. Here's De Morgan's drawing of himself in the pillory. And he mused himself on where, if he's in the pillory, where should James Smith be? And so he says, I'll be in the pillory, and overhead in a cloud will sit Mr. James Smith on one stick laid across two others under a nimbus of 3 1/8 diameters, so 22/8, to the circumference, in pi glory. Oh, for a drawing of the scene. And then he later wrote about Smith. He said, well, Smith is not mad. Madmen reason rightly upon wrong premises. Mr. Smith reasons wrongly upon no premises at all. There's quite a lot in the Budget of Paradoxes about other circle squarers too. And another nice thing that's contained there is De Morgan's sort of riff on Jonathan Swift's poem on infinity. And I've put the Smith one, the Swift one on the left. And what De Morgan wrote: great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. And the great fleas themselves, in turn, have greater fleas to go on, while these again have greater still, and so on. And actually, De Morgan had a genuine mathematical interest in infinity, and mathematicians are constantly interested in infinity and what does it really mean, how many different types of infinity are there, and so on and so forth. And he wrote a mathematical paper on it. This is, I think that I'm particularly fond of this verse that he penned here. And again, it's just so typical of him. So I've already mentioned De Morgan had interest in various learned societies, so I'll tell you a little bit more about those now, particularly these three: the London Mathematical Society, Royal Astronomical Society, and the Royal Society. So with the LMS, De Morgan was the founding president. So the LMS came into existence through his son, not William, one of his other sons, and a friend of his who were both students at University College, and they wanted to form a mathematical society, and they hoped that De Morgan would be the president of it. And actually, but when it came to happen, De Morgan realized that actually it would make much more sense not to just have a student society, but to have a society for mathematicians based in London, because of course Cambridge was where the main, as I've said, the main kind of center of mathematics was. But of course there were a lot of mathematicians actually living in and around London, because they were graduating all these loads of students with maths from Cambridge, and there weren't mathematical jobs for them all. So there were a lot of them were in either school teachers, or they could be in the law, or they could be doing all kinds of things, but still maintaining an interest in maths. And so the London Mathematical Society comes into existence in 1865 with De Morgan as its first president. And this gave him enormous pleasure, as Sophia De Morgan writes here. And one of the things that the society did then and does now was publish journals. And this was actually a very important aspect of the society at that time, because this was a period when British mathematicians didn't have any outlets of their own specifically that was specifically for mathematics. So they could publish in say the Proceedings of the Royal Society or the Cambridge Philosophical Society, but these were journals which carried articles on all different kinds of subjects. And there weren't any specific mathematical journals. So the Proceedings of the London Mathematical Society, which comes into existence with the society, was a very important part of what the work that the society did. And of course it held regular meetings where papers were read and so forth. And De Morgan played an important role in really getting the society on its feet and encouraging people to join, and particularly Cambridge mathematicians such as Cayley and Sylvester, who was in London. Basically the main British mathematicians in certainly in the south of England joined the society. And by all accounts, De Morgan himself was very pleased with his association with the society. The Royal Astronomical Society, this was one of the societies that came into existence in the sort of 1830s, really partly as a result of the fact that the Royal Society had become rather moribund at this point, particularly in terms of mathematics and some of the other sciences. Babbage had been moved to write a real polemic against the Royal Society at this time, because he felt that they weren't doing anything for science, and so also at the same time the Statistical Society was formed, the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and De Morgan himself was a keen supporter of the Royal Astronomical Society, but then and he was vice president on no less than five occasions, but then he fell out with them in 1861. He didn't agree with their method of electing a new president, and he didn't rejoin. But here again we have another, this is also from the Gallery of Portraits, this lovely drawing of Saturn and his rings, Saturn looking rather more like a pumpkin, I think, but I just love this kind of slightly wicked grin that De Morgan has given him. Now, the Royal Society, unsurprisingly perhaps, De Morgan would have no truck with the Royal Society, especially remembering, of course, the run-in over Newton. And this drawing is his drawing of the coat of arms of the Royal Society. And what you see here is a swan, which represents the sort of man of science in sort of deference to the goose, which is crowned, and this represents the Royal Society. And as if to kind of really make the point, the book there that above the two of them is Debrett's Peerage, and there are phrases that also show what De Morgan's views were on the Royal Society. And people tried to encourage him to join, and he absolutely would have nothing to do with it. And one of the things that I think is very evident from his the way he responded to what happened at University College and what happened at the Royal Society, he was very much a man of principle, and he absolutely sort of stuck by his principles. And as far as he was concerned, the Royal Society was not the force for good that it should be. Now, this is interesting, I think, because this is about De Morgan and his views on women. And we see, again, Sophia De Morgan says that he changed his mind. Early in his career, he didn't feel that women had any real role, probably apart from domestically, and that they shouldn't, as she says, meddle with business at all. But he changed his mind quite substantially here. And as she says, as he saw more of life, and And he found that women were not utterly helpless, and his love of justice combined with his better opinion of their powers made him quite willing to concede to them as much as he would have desired for himself, namely the full scope and opportunity for the exercise of all their faculties. And indeed, he gave lectures for free at Bedford College when it opened in 1849, and this was the first higher education college for women. But perhaps most famously, he gave lessons to Ada Lovelace. Ada Lovelace was the daughter of Lord Byron, although she never knew him. He left when her mother when she was a baby, and her mother was very keen that Ada, her daughter, should learn mathematics, and so she was mentored by Mary Somerville, another famous woman scientist, mathematician of the 19th century. And she used to go with Mary Somerville, Ada Lovelace used to go with Mary Somerville to Babbage's, Charles Babbage's soirees. And they used to see Babbage's, where he would talk about and have prototypes and things of his computing machines, particularly his Analytical Engine, for which he is very famous. And she learnt mathematics from De Morgan through almost like a sort of correspondence course, and the correspondence is still extant and it's been digitized. You can see it, it's freely available, and there's you can see the actual original letters and you can see transcriptions of them. And the thing for which Ada Lovelace is most famous today is her translation of the Italian mathematician's Manabria's paper on Babbage's Analytical Engine. And Lovelace not only translated it, but she added a commentary which made the paper something like 5 times longer than it had been originally, showing how much she really understood it, and also what she saw, the kind of power of computing. She could sort of see what the potential for computing could be. And she's very rightly and justly celebrated today. She's sometimes described as the first computer programmer, and that's an inaccurate description, but that's not to diminish what she achieved. But it's very clear from the correspondence that we can see how she learned her mathematics, so how she could be in a position to write her famous paper, and that credit for that has to go to De Morgan. And so I thought I'd just give you a couple of sort of extracts of this correspondence. So this is from, this is De Morgan telling Lovelace to make haste slowly. And so she says, above all, never estimate progress by the number of pages. You can hardly be a judge of the progress you make. And I should say that it's more likely you progress rapidly upon a point that makes you think for an hour than upon an hour's quick reading, even when you feel satisfied. So he's giving her advice about how to study, as well as on the content of her study. And then here we have her writing back, and she says, well, this is very mathematical weather. When one cannot exercise one's muscles out of doors, one is peculiarly inclined to exercise one's brains indoors. Accordingly, I've been setting vigorously to work again with much satisfaction. But I'm sorry to say that I'm sadly obstinate about the term at which convergence begins for the series on page 231 of algebra. So this particular mathematical idea, and which we thought had been made clear by you on Monday evening. And I've enclosed demonstration of my view of the case, which seems to me as clear as possible. So here we can see them exchanging mathematical ideas. Now, of course, Ada Lovelace wasn't the only one of De Morgan's students. He had all his students at University College. And here's a nice testament from the economist and logician Stanley Jevons in 1882. And where he says that as a teacher of mathematics, De Morgan was unrivaled. De Morgan's writings, however excellent, give little idea of the perspicuity and elegance of his viva voce expositions, which never failed to fix the attention of all who were worthy of hearing him. And this is just one of many students who write very glowingly of him as a teacher. Now, I said I would tell you a little bit about Euclid's elements, and here we have a quote from William De Morgan. He described Euclid's Elements as the most entrancing novel in literature. I'm still not quite sure what he means by that, but whether he found it too difficult to understand, but at least we have kind of evidence that he looked at it. But De Morgan was particularly keen about the Elements, and he collected various editions. And in the 19th century, there were many different editions of the Elements were published. And in fact, at that time, it was the second most printed book after the Bible. It was considered essential for boys, it was mostly boys, in their education, both in mathematics, but also more generally. It was considered an important part of a liberal education because of the way the Elements were set out. It was a very logical, it was set out so axiomatically. So you would start with the very basic propositions, and then you would deduce from those propositions. You could deduce further ones, and so on and so forth. So it's all built itself up in a very logical way. So it was supposed to, it was really believed that it would help people to learn to think clearly and to think in a logical fashion. But this actually, there were people towards the end of the century where people disagreed with this from the point of view of it being the best way of teaching the mathematics that was in it, particularly the geometry that was in it. But here we have De Morgan himself. As I say, he collected many copies. He's got this lovely, very early edition from Venice of 1509. And I've illustrated here Todhunter's edition of Euclid, which was published in the middle of the 19th century, because we know that there were over 500,000 copies of it sold, which I mean is really astonishing for a book in the middle of the 19th century. The other point to make is that De Morgan had a fantastic library, not just of mathematics books, and it was his library that is the founding collection of Senate House Library in London. And here's another very attractive edition of the Elements that was published in 1847 by Oliver Byrne, who De Morgan actually considered a minor, rather eccentric mathematician. I don't think he quite approved really of Byrne's edition. And what Byrne wanted to do was to try and do everything visually, sort of pictorially, and kind of strip out as much of the text as possible. And it's really quite a remarkable book. You can, in fact, you can buy a facsimile of it today. It's absolutely beautiful. It was exhibited at the Great Exhibition because it was a masterpiece of printing. And there's also a copy of it online, so you can go and look at it online. But what's also interesting in this particular edition is Byrne thought that this would be a particularly attractive way for women to learn about Euclid's Elements. Now, somebody else who was very keen about Euclid's Elements was Charles Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, author of the Ellis books, who was a friend of William De Morgan. And he published his own editions of the first two books of Euclid. He also wrote a very strong defense of Euclid in 1879, when the kind of Euclid wars were beginning to rage. And he wrote several other mathematics books, which I've listed here. And he was a don at Christ Church in Oxford. And there's a very close association with him and William De Morgan through this the fireplace, and in his rooms at Oxford, because Dodgson commissioned the tiles for his fireplace from William De Morgan. Unfortunately, the fireplace itself no longer exists, but they preserved the tiles and they've had them made into a fire screen. So you can see them on the right there. It's said that it's thought that it's possible that it was the tiles that were the inspiration for Dodgson's Jabberwocky. So I think I'm now going to come to my concluding slides with a little puzzle for you. So I'm just going to give you a minute just to look at this and to see whether you can make anything of it at all. So I'm just going to time it now. Once you've seen it, it will be obvious. Okay, well, I think I'll put you out of your misery. And here are some more in the same vein. And in fact, they're all anagrams of De Morgan's name. And in the Budget of Paradoxes, De Morgan wrote, he said, a friend whom I must not name has since made it up to about 800 anagrams on my name. He didn't list all of those, but I think that it's just so typical of De Morgan, and I feel it's a good way to end the talk. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, June. I certainly enjoyed that. I think it's absolutely fascinating to get a sense of the household that William De Morgan was growing up in and what might have inspired him to not necessarily focus on mathematics, but certainly for that to so influence the beautiful geometric designs that I think our audience will be quite familiar with. And even if you're not, to learn so much about this fascinating mathematician, especially how he wanted to share his subject, much as I've mentioned that June loves to do as well. And these problems that mathematicians of the 19th century were thinking of, that we've only just been able to prove or disprove by using computers, it really shows that their level of thinking and reasoning was quite astonishing, really. And I'm certain it was because of his father Augustus that William was inspired with his drawing and to sort of embed geometry into his designs. So thank you for enlightening us to all of that, June. If anybody does have questions, then do feel free to put those into the chat box and I can direct them to June. I know we've only got a couple of minutes left and some people have said they have to leave us, so apologies about that, but I think June's got time to stay. I hope so anyway, we can ask a couple of questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
So please do ask questions.
Yeah, so one to kick things off is, whereabouts in the southwest did Augustus live?
Oh, now I'm not absolutely sure about that. I should know.
I can perhaps help a little bit.
Yeah.
In that I know that William was born on Gower Street, so they did live in university accommodation whilst he was professor, which is on Gower Street in London. And an interesting sort of fact is that that's also where Millet's parents had a house and where the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was established when William was about 10 years old. So that sort of puts that into a little bit of context. The same person has asked, is the house private or open to the public? I think it still belongs to the university. I can't just remember off the top of my head what number Gower Street it was, but I think, and June might know a little bit better than I do, but I think quite a lot of that area still is owned by the university.
Yes, I mean, it is. There are lots and lots of blue plaques everywhere, or all around there, aren't there?
Yeah. Any more for any more? So we've got some lovely thank yous coming in, June, as well. So thank you very much for such an interesting talk, and thank you for a fascinating talk.
Well, thank you. And if anybody thinks of any questions subsequently, I'm always very happy to take them by email. You can find me quite easily on if you Google. I'm at the Open University, so don't, if something comes to you later, don't hesitate.
Thank you. Well, we have had one more, Jean, so we'll have one more to finish off, which was just noting the dates earlier. Was Newton still alive when De Morgan criticised him?
No. So Newton died in 1741, was it? Something like that. So he's a whole, century later. So the British had a long time by this time. And Newton, it's quite clear, Newton really kind of fashioned his legacy. He made sure that if you see everything about Newton in the 18th century, so it's all very, very kind of positive. But I have to tell you just a little anecdote, which was the thing that actually got me into history of maths, was when I was doing my maths degree at King's College in London. I had a calculus tutorial, and the lecturer came in with somebody we didn't know. It was the first one, and he sort of looked at us all, and then he went, Isaac Newton. We also think, Isaac Newton is Isaac Newton, second nastiest person to come out of Grantham. And of course, this was Maggie Thatcher era, where Maggie Thatcher came from Grantham. And of course, I had never thought about Newton as being nice or nasty. And of course, I mean, he's a human being like anybody else. Just because he's a mathematician doesn't mean he can't be nice or nasty. And of course, it actually matters, because of course, it's to do with the kind of relationships you have and the way you behave. He was he was an absolute genius. I mean, there's no question that he's probably, the greatest scientific genius, probably, some people would argue, that we've ever had in this country, even now. What he achieved was simply remarkable. So I absolutely don't want to diminish that in any way at all. But it didn't necessarily make him a nice person. So this whole cover up, and there has been lots and lots kind of written about it, but it was Augustus De Morgan who was the first person to bring it all to light. And again, I think it really shows him as a man of principle, because people were still, they were really revering Newton. I mean, how could it be that somebody wouldn't want to kind of cover this up even more? But not, De Morgan was the right man for the job. I mean, he absolutely was.
That's it, and like you say, sort of outed him.
Yeah.
Was damaging to a reputation. Yeah. Interesting to think of historical figures just as people like you and I.
Yeah.
And so four historic figures' names being thrown into the mixed in the questions, June, which is, was Alan Turing a distant relation at all?
I don't think so. I don't think there was any. I've never ever heard of any connection.
In my knowledge of the sort of more recent family history, I've not come across that either.
Yeah.
So yeah, a closing comment before I hand over to you for yours, June, is from Geraldine in the chat. Thank you. What a fascinating man, so clever and amusing, and that speaks to his son William as well, who was well known for his wit and sense of humour amongst his peers. So like father, like son, I suppose. And just huge thanks again to you, June.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And I think that's one of the things that I really warmed to De Morgan, because he does have, he has this real kind of personality where he can kind of poke fun at things, and you just get this sense of joy in some of the things that he's doing. And he was so productive. I mean, that's the thing, it's just remarkable how he ever slept, being the amount of writing he did. I just think all these little sketches, these cartoons and things are just so delightful, and they do really show he had a real talent with a pen, and one can't help but feel that really did have an important influence on William. And one can just imagine him drawing kind of cards for his children, and when writing letters to his children or whatever, just covering them with little nice little cartoons and things. And like that one of Saturn. I mean, I just love that one of Saturn with this kind of wicked grin, sort of. So I mean, it's been a real pleasure for me, actually, kind of burrowing a bit deeper into De Morgan in this particular connection of his work, rather than just looking strictly at the mathematics, and of course, having had the opportunity to see the wonderful exhibition the Sublime Symmetry exhibition when it was here in London. It's fantastic. Yeah. So thank you, Sarah, for yeah, inviting me to join you in this wonderful journey.
Absolutely, yeah, and thank you so much. And June's mentioned the exhibition. That exhibition, of course, is Sublime Symmetry, which looks directly at William De Morgan's use of that linear geometry that he seemed to love so much within his ceramic designs. And that has just opened today at the Lady Lever Art Gallery on the Wirral, part of National Museums Liverpool. So we're very excited to have it on display in the Northwest. And if anybody can get along, that's open today and closes on the 9th of January. So a lovely Christmas treat, perhaps.
Yeah.
Thanks again, June, for bringing us to life for us today and sharing some of his wit, humour and mathematics. And thank you to everybody for coming along.
Yes, yeah. Thank you all very much. And I'll say goodbye now.
And yes, thank you. Thank you again, June.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.